we're going to have a quick introduction first, where we discuss what we would have been doing if we were at the event, and then we'll get on to questions. So, Andy, do you want to go first?
Hi, I'm Raff. What time is it? It is just gone 1 in the afternoon on a Saturday, so I will be prepping for an afternoon plenipotentiary, because there's always one in the afternoon on a Saturday. And I will also be prepping for the eternal audience that is going to happen after that plenipotentiary, because there's always one on a Saturday afternoon, while simultaneously prepping for the plenipotentiary or diplomatic encounter that would be taking place on Saturday evening, because there's always one that's happening on a Saturday evening. That's my event. Depending on the weather, I might not be wearing a top.
Yeah, Andy, it's very sunny outside. You are absolutely not in Alt Universe where E1 is happening. There's just no question that you're not wearing a top, and that's just all of our burden to bear. Shall I go next?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I was at the event, I would probably be in my pajamas, having resoundingly failed to get up on time or indeed get dressed, sitting around chatting to Matt and Andy. So in many ways, it would be exactly like this, except I'd be in a field. More accurately, so although I'd probably be running some plot out, so I might have some planned encounter and NPCs to brief for. But often, because I like to be quite timely and get stuff out, wait stuff towards kind of Friday or even Saturday morning sometimes. By kind of Saturday afternoon, often what I've done is moved more towards solving Matt's problems. In that, quite often, and this is a role I enjoy as a member of the plot team. Matt will have written some Wind of Fortune or some plot. He will have written checks that he fundamentally can't cash because he's a very busy man who's trying to deal with like someone will be on fire or something like that. It won't be good. And so he'll be like, will someone please save me from my bad life decisions? And I will be there going, yes, Matt, I will run your plot out on no notice. We have no brief. That's exactly what I want to do. And that is something I really enjoy. So I hope Matt never actually becomes organised, because then I'll be...
I think the chances of me becoming organised is shortly before. It's like one of the horsemen of the apocalypse. That's not going to happen. Yes, if I were at an event, I would be desperately pleading at Wrenna, saying, "Oh my God, I've written more plot that I can run. Can you make this problem go away?" The positive things I'd be doing, I think around this time I'd be meeting up with John Creek. We'd be looking at some of the Senate stuff that had come in, constitutional court issues. I'd be desperately thinking, am I going to get time to get into costume and get a few hours of role playing Abraham in this weekend, which I always enjoy. And yeah, I think we'd have come off the battle by now, so we'd have had an update from them about what was happening there. So we'd be sort of feeding that into things. Yeah, that's where that's where I'd be. I think
we imminently have
courting.
I was about to say, I think we imminently have of John and probably Amy turning up to talk to us about the Senate session, while we're both trying to do 2 other things at once.
And inevitably the Senate will have done something, or there'll be something proposed. There'll be like a lot of stuff which is fairly like okay, and then there'll be 1 or 2 things which for one reason or another require extensive where it's strictly not allowed to sort of participate, because they just get nothing done. They're often quite interesting discussions, but they do take quite a while to get finished sometimes.
Yeah, they do.
And I would have just come out of the battlefield, and probably can try and get some snacks.
Yeah, and then possibly playing some kind of one of your own NPCs at some point. I imagine like a shifty bastard, but a shifty so and so, but.
Steve would never typecast himself in that role in every single role he creates.
It's a gift. Shall we start with the questions rather than...
Yeah.
So Jeffrey Willoughby has asked a couple, but I'm going to choose one of them. How do you determine the borderline for interesting news between Winds of Fortune and B, drop it on an NPC or ambassador?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think I've made the mistake in the past of putting something in the Wind of Fortune which was too minor, and I think mostly we avoid doing the opposite, but sometimes it does happen, right? So sometimes there's something which we feel like more people should know about, but you put it on an NPC. And indeed, am I right in saying that somehow that's part of why Winds of Fortune were kind of invented, right? To sort of make sure people were aware of. Like in the earlier days, I feel like more stuff would go on an NPC and therefore not properly get like people wouldn't understand that it had happened in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly one of the things Winds of Fortune do really well that an NPC doesn't is publicize the nitty-gritty details. So if you've got a complex offer that says, well, if you give us 3 of these and we give you 7 of those, we'll build you one of these, but you'll have to build us one of those, and they'll have to have a thing here. If you attempt to run that out in the field, it will be a disaster, because every single person that interacts with the NPC will come away with a different idea of what the deal is. Put it on the wiki firsthand and just put it up there in plain language for everyone to see, and you avoid that misinformation problem. So many people have got the right picture that the wrong impression can't spread. So that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, I think actually you've got the flip side of that though, is that sometimes there is a plot where you want people to have maybe at an earlier stage in a plot where you want people to have a slightly misleading a misleading impression of what has happened in a situation.
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily all public knowledge. Winds of Fortune are written in this sort of what I might call wiki voice. It's a sort of mostly neutral. It's not out of character. Well, parts of it are out of character. Some bits are sort of in character, but they're broadly meant to represent what you could, a generally well-informed person could have picked up by talking to a variety of people, getting their different points of view and synthesizing it. That doesn't mean there won't be something there that's wrong, but if it's sort of not correct, it'll be because someone is trying to give a deliberately false impression. And in general, I think you try to avoid like deliberate deception. It's just that sometimes like you might not get the whole story in a Wind of Fortune. A good example of this actually is that I ran some plot with some people who are under Jotun occupation in the Mornwald from the village of Whittle, and the first Wind of Fortune didn't mention the fact that they were followers of the virtue of purity, which caused some controversy later on when it came up. But then, kind of as that became more obvious and a thing that the man or woman on the I don't know Tasato omnibus would know, then it becomes sort of ready for things to go into the Wind of Fortune. So, or you know, like when all the mirrors in Sarvos shattered, yeah, you can't miss that. And indeed, if something's happened in the world, and like you really should know it if you're from that place, then it should be in the Winds of Fortune, because otherwise it's going to give people weird experiences on the field where one person says, "Did you hear that X has happened?" And you know, sometimes you've not read the Wind of Fortune, and that's fine, right? But you know, you want to give people as much opportunity as they can to feel informed about the place that their character lives, given that we can't represent an entire empire.
We'll often use language. It can be a bit subtle sometimes, so I'm not sure even I always spot it, but we will use phrases like... Wait, is Wrenna? I'm looking at the Twitch stream instead of Discord. Sorry, people. We will often use language that says things like "some people say," or "it could be," or "it is believed," which is to signpost something that might not be true.
Yeah. But we don't use that much of it in a Wind of Fortune, because generally the purpose of the Wind of Fortune is to present you with a bunch of information that you can then use and roleplay and make decisions about in the field. So by its nature, the core information in a Wind of Fortune has to be correct. Otherwise, it's meaningless. It doesn't have any value. There might be some elements of it which are unclear or potentially wrong or so forth. But the core of it, and so Winds of Fortune are ideally suited for serving up plot that is based around a thing has happened, here are some things you could do about it.
Wrenna...
Whereas opportunities to find things out are better done with NPCs and plots in the field.
Wrenna touched on this a little bit with the discussion about Whittle. The Wind of Fortune was very heavy on facts. These people exist. This is the scenario as it is understood. It might, if we were doing it today, it would have included details, perhaps, of some of any Senate project that they were suggesting could be happening. But what it didn't do, as you say, is tell you anything about them as people, because the NPCs going onto the field were there to present the people. The Wind of Fortune was partly to deal with the factuality, but also be on the same page, but also to alert you to the fact that these NPCs will be on the field at a certain time in a certain place, and that tells you where the encounter is happening.
I've just seen. I don't disagree. I've just seen a question in the Twitch chat, which I think contains a misapprehension that we should perhaps address. If you don't mind us segueing slightly. So Faland Gaspar says a Wind of Fortune is still going to be written as an article by an Imperial civil servant, right? Though, so they do have IC bias, sort of. So I just don't believe this is correct. The Wind of Fortune that you read is not written by some Imperial civil servant. It is a it is not an IC. Some people produce summaries of Wind of Fortune as their characters, and those contain or could contain IC bias. That's absolutely true, and that's within the rules of the game. But like, we don't. There's no character writing Winds of Fortune in the Winds of Fortune will be put on the wiki in universe.
You talked about the voice, and I think there is a very distinct style on the wiki where we deliberately present the content in a voice that could be read out in the field and still remain perfectly in character. I think there's a phrase, isn't there, in films where the music it appears in the film and diegetic. So there's an attempt to present the information in a way that, and indeed people do just cut and paste the wiki and then present it as an in-character document, and that's it's meant that it can be done like that. But that doesn't mean that you should assume that there is a biased IC author. There's no attempt. If we deliberately put bias in, that would be an attempt to trick the readers, to trick the players, and that wouldn't serve any purpose. I
mean, you can imagine the problem that would cause if that was true, right? Because let's say a player's character perceived bias in the text of a Wind of Fortune, then technically, if that was attached to an actual civil servant, then because they're a character who exists in the world, there's no reason they couldn't call that civil servant for Inquisition, and we'd have to toddle Andy onto the field as some different civil servant from his normal in a funny hat or whatever to IC account for the text that he had OC written with Matt in a furious haze of editing, and no one wants to be there. It's not the game that we're running, and I don't think it would be particularly fun.
It's a really important thing to think about around boundaries and what is, the game is like a sandbox, but not everything is inside the sandbox. And there's a really obvious example of this with historical research. With historical research, you can select one of three different departments, one of three different researchers to go away and do the research. And each of those researchers has a known bias. So the bias is part of that because you have control over it, and you as the player base select which researcher you send. Nobody has, and so those things are inside the sandbox, and they're meant to exist within the world, and you're meant to take account of them.
I've written researchers which have been deeply biased, but very, very clearly from the perspective of the NPC that I was playing.
No player has any choice over what civil servants or what the people who are creating the wiki content. Now, in theory, if they insisted, we might drag some civil servant up so they could Inquisition them. But there's no game there. It doesn't serve any function. That thing is deliberately outside the sandbox. It's just not fun for anyone. We don't believe it'd be any fun for the players. It certainly wouldn't be any fun for us. So we don't put that bias in, because identifying and fixing for it wouldn't achieve anything. It'd just be dull.
That's even more apparent, I think, in Appraisal, the power where we specifically list out Mladen Escovich, Graciano Lopez Higuera, and Naomi of Virtue's Rest as the people who will look at a problem the Senate has called out with a specific viewpoint in mind, whether that's the most economic, the most efficient, or the most off the wall. I forget what their specific biases are.
If someone's got a bias or a known flaw almost, we will be really explicit about it and we will signpost it. The Druge always lie. They always cheat. They always break their word. We don't hide that away. We don't spring it on you. We go, this is a known thing. The biases of the three different appraisal techniques are known so that deciding on the basis of that knowledge is part of the game.
I think it's worth making a more general point, which I think is very obvious, because I think it's even part of the plot writing guide. But if you've not really thought about how you run LARPs, it's maybe not obvious. Why is NPCs lying and LARP, which is a thing they do, but why can it be slightly fraught? Because LARP is basically about a shared reality. I think the example you like to tell, Matt, is if I send an NPC in who comes onto the field and goes, there's a host of goblins or orcs or whatever over that hill, like you have no way of going to that hill to check, and so you are primed by the medium of LARP to believe that person, right? Like even though that might not be a rational thing to believe in character, people's characters will be more likely to believe it because of the nature of the medium. And so you have to be, and this is less true in, say, a tabletop role-playing game, but where, although there's a degree of shared reality, there's a lot less people, so it's a lot easier to maintain coherence. But Empire is a game of thousands and like multiple thousands of people, all of whom need to have the illusion that everyone is believing in the same shared reality as them as much as possible. And so the more you mess with that, the more you can get into difficulty, and that's essentially why we have to be careful about it.
It's a bit off topic, but I would almost argue that the problem you're talking about is more true in tabletop role playing. When I'm tabletop role playing and I say, "Oh, this is a thing," as the DM, I don't expect the players around the table to start questioning it. That the assumption is that they will accept what I'm saying as the DM as the truth. I think it's like a privileged. You've got a privileged narrator. There's a literary concept of the unreliable narrator, which is where you slowly reveal that everything that the people are discovering might not be true, and that works as a literary style, but it's not really. It's not as a DMing style.
So I disagree, and in a DMing context, if you've got a group. So I have run a game called I won't get into this, but I've run games where there were things that my players didn't know, and I was lying about some of the premises of the game, but I had at least made them aware beforehand that they didn't have all the facts. I didn't say what facts were wrong, which facts were right, but I was like, a theme of this game is not maybe knowing exactly what's going on, and I might lie to you. But there's a social contract aspect to that, which means it's a lot easier to do that on a smaller, I suppose it appears in all different sorts of stuff, but I personally feel it's harder with LARP because of the volume of people. And in a tabletop, if you do think someone's got the wrong end of the stick and you are diverging from a shared reality, it's a lot easier to be aware of it and fix it. That is not the case in Empire, where quite happily we could have a group of players believing something to be true, which is not true, for years potentially, and we wouldn't know about it because it would be happening at a level where it wasn't bubbling up for us to see about it. I'm sure that is happening to some degree. We would like to minimize the amount that it is, and that's not because they're not necessarily not because they're doing anything wrong, but actually because, well, I mean, it's okay if their characters are wrong about things. We just don't want them to have believe something is true about the world on a sort of player level because of some misunderstanding that we've created there, because it creates a sheer later on.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be in character wrong. It's rubbish to be out of character wrong about in character stuff. If you know your character is wrong, that's super cool, and you're role playing it anyway, that's great. But if you think your character is right about the things you're role playing, then it's not fun to discover you're wrong.
I think it can be fun. Actually, I've enjoyed it in role playing games, but it's why I'm saying I think you need to be.
It doesn't work through Empire. Let's take a simple practical example. If you're in the Senate and the senators are discussing the price that a fortification is going to cost. Now, in the real world, the world is full of cost overruns. All of these things are best guesses, they are approximations, and so forth. So in the real world, you might legitimately say, well, are we sure this fortification is going to cost this? Who came up with this estimate? What if they're biased? None of that goes anywhere in Empire. We just say that fortification will cost X 100 white granite, then that's what it's going to cost. There's no possibility that somehow that might turn out to be wrong.
Also, except for in very specific circumstance, with so there's Brega's Land, where if you build a fort on a marsh, it might cost more, but that's explicitly laid out on the wiki, and that's very important.
Did we answer the bit about how we decide between the two, Wind of Fortune or NPC?
There's so many variables. We only just touched on it, but it's all of those things. It's things like, does this plot benefit from having real concrete facts laid out to everyone? Is it something everyone should know about? Does it concern lots and lots of players? Does it require everyone to know when this thing is going to happen? Those are all things that move something to a Wind of Fortune.
Let's move on.
Mm.
I'm going to stick with Geoffrey Willoughby. Imagine the flavour text is written by a variety of folk, given the many / all areas of the game world that it has touched on. Have characters repeated in the fluff from one Wind of Fortune to another.
Yes, quite a lot. There are whole mini sagas out there. There are the three Imperial Orcs in their little happy family. There is an ongoing story of romance and marriage in the Brass Coast, scattered through a number of the Brass Coast ones. There is a touching, tragic story of highborn folk in the wake of the liberation of Rykos, which you can follow through. There are a couple of high-ranking League ladies who are regularly basically Sattler and Waldorfing whatever is going on with politics at the moment. Who show up through a number of Winds of Fortune. Yes, I enjoy it. I like revisiting characters that I've used before in Winds of Fortune.
It's a bit where you get to be an indulgent writer and like live your dreams, right? So
yeah, totally. There was a period, I think, where Andy was saying we should drop this bit because we're behind on the schedule and we're struggling. And I was like, no, this is the bit I really enjoy. It is absolutely the indulgent moment. So yeah, we do reuse them. I certainly reuse lots of characters, and I really like. To me, I know I've done a good Wind of Fortune when I've created a good character that I think, I want to use that character again. It's, from my personal point of view, I've enjoyed that piece of writing.
Yeah, and also everyone loves Three Hands. Like, they are the best.
That is a terrible character. I don't know why everyone likes that character.
I think we're having some sound difficulties with Andy. Do we want to just try and pause and sort it?
I have no idea why we're having sound problems with me because I haven't changed anything from when I was doing the All for Amber last night. So
and was that fine?
As far as I know, nobody said it wasn't. I currently have all the lights that I own on and aimed at my head. I might be able to do that. Does that work? Oops.
I don't think that's going to change the sound.
No, but it makes it easier to see my lips.
Well, you just block your lips, Andy. So move it slightly to the left, slightly to your right. Yeah.
I don't have enough subway boxes up here to make it balance properly. Right?
I can hear you fine. So
okay. I can hear everybody fine through the Discord. I'm not sure why I won't be showing up. Can other people hear me when I'm talking?
So at least one person in chat says I can hear you. At least one person in chat says that they can hear you.
Okay.
I'm hoping March B that's a little better for you. We'll see if we make it, but I'm not sure Andy can make any more adjustments right now. Sorry, shall we?
Please adjust your Andy.
Yeah, basically you're just coming in at a lower volume than the rest of us, essentially, and so I suspect the balance is not so much there.
It's tricky for me to adjust things because obviously we're broadcasting from my computer.
You've not got a volume knob on your microphone, have you?
I have, yes. It's currently at full volume. Give me 2 seconds. I will just try something.
That's answering.
So obviously we do a lot with sharing, with tagging nations and archetypes and various people in Wind of Fortunes on the wiki itself when they go up.
Does that have any positive effect?
What, changing the headset?
Probably not with regards to new players. We could do a lot better.
I genuinely don't know. One of the things I think is it's really hard to get good feedback. So you do some stuff and they think, oh, this will help, but you don't really know whether it's worked or not. I think that the marketing could call it A/B testing or something. We don't do a lot of that, any of it. So
I think you do experiments at times, but I know what you mean. I think a problem that I have. Sorry, go on. You're talking. I'm just.
No, I don't know that I've learned anything about how to get people more involved with plot from Winds of Fortune. I'm sat here thinking, I don't know what I've learned.
We know, we are pretty confident, we are 90% confident that if you tell people about plot, more of them have the opportunity to get involved.
Yeah.
So categorically, we know that if we want a lot of people to know something or be involved in something, you put it in a Wind of Fortune or a Wind of War. You do not send an NPC out into the field to talk to everybody in Wintermark about it.
Yeah, I think, which was in some sense like the question is how do you get people to engage with Winds of Fortune? But I think in some sense it's the wrong way around. It's like, well, we want to write plot. The question is how do we get people to engage with it? And in that sense, Winds of Fortune are a step up.
Yeah.
Individual NPCs, and again, I always come back to scale. I think the thing is that Empire has just is on a, when you're running a large fest LARP like Empires, I guess. There's just the amount you have to do is just so much. You need that leverage of attack, and the Wind of Fortune kind of gives that. I will say that you asked about how to engage new players, and I actually struggle with this a bit. I realized because I've been LARPing now for about 10 years, and I still feel like to some of these people I'm like a new LARPer, but this is just no longer the case, right? And so I've been LARPing for about a decade, and I've been attending fest events for maybe about the same. I played the firstborn the last year of Maelstrom. So not only do I not remember how to be, and I haven't played Empire in ages, so I don't remember what it's like to be an Empire player. I don't remember what it's like to be a new Empire player. I don't really remember what it's like to be a new LARPer anymore. And I can try to empathize with those things, but it's just, I think that is a difficulty that I have at times, is to remember what it was like. Because I remember the first time I walked onto the Maelstrom field at E1 in the last year, and there was a feeling when you walk onto your first fest field that is like nothing else. And I only dimly remember it, but it is. And I had it at Odyssey too, almost more so Odyssey, which was very much kind of my beloved fest game. Just because I sort of played it at a really good time. And just that sense of being the infinite possibility of everything. And actually now I've been behind the fence a while, and I'm a bit older and a bit more cynical. You sort of see the limits a bit more, and you get a bit, and you lose a little of that sense of dewy-eyed, starry-eyed wonder that you have that certainly I think I had the first time. But also the fears too, the anxieties and nervousness. And those things too, I sort of don't have in quite the same way anymore. So sometimes I think I do try to chat to people who are playing the game or who are newer to the game. And I don't try to give them an indication of what I'm fishing for, but it's nice I sort of like to try to get a read on at least some players, just so I have some idea about how stuff filters through. Like, okay, I know we ran this thing. What does this person heard about it? Okay, that's interesting. So that tells me this thing. And that doesn't necessarily feed into how we all write Winds of Fortune, but I think it has informed how I have done some stuff, watching an engagement. But of course, that's limited to a degree, because I know a section of the LARP community who play Empire, a relatively small section, and I don't know large other chunks. So I feel like there are things that I miss.
I've been LARPing for 3 decades, and I still occasionally feel like a new LARPer, which is patently absurd. I have to remind myself I've been doing this a very long time. I think it's notable when we set Empire up that we had no plot writers who'd played the game. Duh. And we had a bunch of people who'd written plot for other systems, and that's fine. But the benefits when Steve and Wrenna joined the plot writing team as people who had played the game and had real experience of what it was like in the field, made a fundamental difference because they bring insights that just weren't there previously. Now, that's not to criticise any of us old lags who whatever, but it does make a difference. But actually, I honestly think I'd turn the whole thing around on its head. It's not about how would I make it more appealing to new players. It's like, if you're a new player, if you're coming to your first Empire, probably the best tip I could give you to have a good time is skim through the Winds of Fortune, pick one that sounds cool and have a really strong opinion about it, and then turn up at the game and have a strong opinion about it at everyone. And I think you'll have much more fun doing that than spending hours on your backstory and how many uncles were killed by the Druge and how many bricks were in the hall that they burned down. No one will care about any of that. But have a really strong opinion about something in a Wind of Fortune or a couple of Winds of Fortune. And I think as a new player, you've got a real solid way then to get into the game. So I don't know how I would make them more appealing to new players other than to say, yeah, look, use this. This is the great starting point for getting into Empire.
So I'm actually going to go to the next question, which is from Pip Brewer, which is related to what Matt was just saying, which is how can a newbie hone in on the useful stuff in the Winds of Fortune to help create an exciting character background, ideally a background which is relevant to recent and upcoming events?
So the key mechanical way that you can do that is to read them. And that sounds facile, but it's really easy. I often see people go, I've come up with a character for Empire, but I haven't decided what nation I'm going to be in yet. And you think, I don't. If you create your character and your background before you've worked out where you're from in the world and what you care about, you've neglected the things that are really going to add value and be relevant in the field. So I would almost say the best way is to not think about your background at all until you've read a few Winds of Fortune. And if there's nothing in the current set that appeals, go back a set, because you can always pick up an issue from the previous event and be outraged about it. Go through there and think about the people that are being described, the effects that things are having on them, and think, hey, what if we play one of these people, these outraged people from the Mournland, or these outraged people from
I think you might be thinking of a specific character, because I think there's a character in the Marches. I don't know if we should name them, but there's a character in the Marches, I think, who specifically came in as a player, but kind of in response to the Winds of Fortune that we've been writing about people in the Mournland are really cross, and they went into the game and were a cross person from the Mournland, and I've got a ton of game out of that, basically. Someone in chat asks, what happens when you follow Matt's advice, go along to an event, you really care about Wind of Fortune, but there's a group of players who've already kind of cornered that plot because they've got all the political connections, all the money, they've got all the hats, and you're new, and it would be lovely if every player took maybe a generous approach to the plot, but that's not absolutely not mandatory. And some people maybe are like, no, this is the thing I'm pursuing, and we'll just kind of, how do you deal with being kind of pushed back? You've decided to create a character, you care about this issue, and then you find that issue is completely sewn up on the field, and you can't get anywhere because everyone's mates with each other and they've got all the dosh.
How do you deal with that? Well, in effect, what you're describing is a game that you've turned up at where the piece of plot you've decided to get interested in isn't opening up and isn't engaging you and isn't giving you interesting play. One of the challenges of a live role-playing game is we can't consistently deliver a perfectly enjoyable experience. There's 2,500 completely random actors in the field, and we don't have control over what they will do or say. We'd love them all to be playing in a very open and engaged way, but they're not all going to do that. So there's always a chance you go to any game and have a poor experience, and that will be true with any live role-playing game in any format, in any medium, at any time. I think it's unlikely that you would go to Empire and just find that the entire issue was completely sewn up and no game at all was happening. If that happens, we as the writers have got our job wrong, and it's reasonable to blame me personally or blame the plot team, because an issue should be controversial. We don't write Winds of Fortune that are designed so 2,500 people go, oh yeah, that's fine. Just option A, please.
I will say that this is one of the reasons Empire's designed all these different sort of houses of power, if you like, in that it's very unlikely. It can happen, but it would be supreme political power on the kind of other side of the point, that an issue is completely sewn up in both the Senate, the Synod, the Conclave, the people with Dosh, the military council, right? It might mean you have to take a lateral approach, right? There's some issue, and the straightforward solution to that would be to build a widget out of white granite and get that through the Senate. You can't build any widgets. Okay. And that's how you would solve that bit of the plot. But it doesn't mean you can't touch that plot with, is there a magical angle? Could you potentially go, I care about this, so I'm going to lobby an archmage to use their plenipotentiary power to stick an eternal in this problem. It will probably make the problem worse, but it might be like it worse in an interesting or different way that then gives you an angle of inroad in that you didn't have before. The Synod are notorious as an ordinary lot who do not like bow to political pressure or convenience a lot of the time. And so I think a lot of people have made a lot of game by making a lot of trouble in the Synod and using the good old-fashioned power of not mob violence, but like of mob or whipping up a mob against a thing. And suddenly someone who thought they got all their political strength sewn up finds that actually things are dissolved. You know, there are so many ways to attack a problem using the and then there's the informal things. There's the structures that almost we as the game designers don't know about. Of like who knows who, of where do people spend their evenings, of who can you talk to. You know, I think that the important thing is that if you feel like something is completely blocked off, often that might be less true than you think. And we try to give as many ways for you to approach the political problems as you can. Now, as we've mentioned, like in a Wind of Fortune, there'll often be like to solve this, you to if you build this widget, X will happen. But you know that doesn't mean you can't do other stuff that will affect the world and therefore might kind of fall into that kind of stuff. Would you say that? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. I think the one thing to be wary of is sometimes you will encounter players who are very deliberately trying to give you the impression that an issue is completely settled because it currently has an outcome that they want, and the last thing they want is anybody causing trouble about it. You should definitely make as much trouble as possible for those people. They might pretend they don't want you to create trouble for them and their neat political solution, but they really do. You'll be making their game. So don't accept on face value if things appear to be settled. But ultimately, if you're a brand new player and it's your first game and you've come up with a concept and you're going to really engage with the game and you think it's going to play out in such a way and it just doesn't, maybe you change your characterization mid-game in a way that will give you fun. Your character is a vehicle to have fun. I once went to a game with pre-generated characters, and the pre-generated character I was given was a peacemaker, someone who basically tried to solve arguments and get everyone to get on with each other and not fall out and so forth. And I realized within the first 6 hours that the problem in the game was that people were very happy to get on and not fall out. And so because it was a lot, so I tweaked my character and turned them into the most awful, gossipy, troublemaking ferret rooting out problems and dragging them into the light where everybody would have to argue about them, because I saw that was going to make me game. So basically I tweaked my characterization. So if everybody thinks that we should do option A and you wanted to do option B, go, okay, we should do option A, but we should do option A plus. Option A isn't enough. We should be doing twice what option A is. Or, you know, if people want a trade deal with the Grendel, start sending the Grendel messengers and be a sellout to the Empire and say, oh, you can't believe how easy these people are to buy into what you know. Just react to what is happening in the field and don't turn up with an absolutely fixed view of how you're going to play the game with your very first character.
I will
with ideas. But if it's not working out, and talk to the new player team, just, you know, get help and react and get advice. And
I know some people enjoy this in LARP, but it's never worked. I know some people enjoy this in LARP, but it's never worked for me, which is I actually don't quite play the same way as you. I like to have a fairly fixed characterization for my character, but a thing which I've done multiple times and has always kind of disappointed me is sort of visualizing too strongly a particular scene I want to play out at the game. Because in my experience, unless you've essentially agreed with a bunch of people OC beforehand that a scene's going to play out, and I know some people do that. It's absolutely not the kind of LARP I enjoy, but I know those people enjoy it. But personally, for me, that one, I don't like doing that. And visualizing a scene in advance that's dependent on how other people will react that I can't control Like it's just not going to go. So don't get your heart set on a particular interaction or scene or something like that going the way that you think it will. I write my plots and my characters and everything that have what I call kind of emotional and thematic consistency. That's what I really like doing in my writing. And that's kind of what I kind of pull through, and I get a lot of joy from that. So often I'll create a character, but that means you want to create characters who, when they hit barriers, will not give up, right? Like it's not, if you play a character with quite low resilience to problems, then when you encounter problems, which you will, or what do you do? And actually, here's a hot thing. If you role play a lot, if you feel like, but I don't feel like in my life I'm good at dealing with problems. In LARP, if you play a character who's you're role playing to be good at, who's role playing to be resilient and bounce back from problems, then that can be really hard at first if that doesn't come naturally to you. But pretending to do it as a person who doesn't exist can both make you better at that as that person and in real life. And that is weird. It's weird but true. But like LARP can be quite good for like learning how to do something in a safe way, right? Because if you mess up as a character, well, what's the consequences?
Yeah, nobody dies.
No,
nobody real dies. Cool.
We'll go to the next one. Gregory Carslaw asks, Windsor Fortune often suggests possible responses to them. Be in this place at this time, raise a mandate with this wording, get a Senate to build this thing. A lot of the time, people do things outside of these suggestions. For example, raising a statement of principle in the Synod about something that was suggested to the Senate issue, seeking a declaration of concord about the implication of something suggested to the skirmish and stuff like that. To what extent is this good or bad for the game and for the player's experience?
I think it's awesome for the game within certain limits. One of the problems is that what a Windsor Fortune does is present you with a problem. And then what we try to do is give you a menu of possible solutions, all of which have compromises. There's never a solution, which is where if you pick option C, everything's great, the problem goes away, and there are no more costs or consequences or compromises. That's just never a choice ever in a Windsor Fortune, because if it was, everyone would choose option C. The problem is that players sometimes assume that they can offer a solution which makes the problem go away. So if we've got a conflict, if we say, there's a problem here, the people from Village A hate the people from Village B and vice versa, and the two are fighting, you could build a giant wall between them. It would cost X white granite, or you could relocate these people here. That would cost Y. The player might then say, well, I want a solution where I go there and I talk to both sides and I make them happy with each other. And it's like it just doesn't work. There's no plot. Once that's a possible solution, there's no plot.
I mean, in some sense, I don't mind the idea that a player might try, but it's unlikely. There's unlikely to be an easy, because actually, if there was an easy solution to the problem, presumably it would have.
Somebody would have done it already,
right? Yeah, or it would have happened.
The low-hanging fruit has been picked.
It doesn't mean there's not the lateral thinking. Can't think of a way of solving something that means we go, oh my goodness, or actually, no, I get, oh, that's quite interesting, and it just, but like, you have
so
to
an
try
obvious
and quite
example
hard.
in that scenario is the Senate could try and pass a law that means that those two groups of people aren't allowed to interact with each other. Just run with this for a second. One that's neither of the two costly suggestions we put forward. It is a way of reacting to that problem, and we would take that and then we would look at it and we might decide, for example, that those two people are now more angry with the Senate for putting draconian laws in place than they are with each other for a bit. So you have had a solution. It's just not a free solution in which everybody is happy with each other.
If you propose a solution and we accept that proposal and put it on a Windsor Fortune, which we do with things like mandates, it will always come up with a new set of costs and consequences of its own. And sometimes when we offer that back to the player, they go, oh, well, I don't want to do it in that case, because they've realised that once it comes with a set of costs and consequences, they're not interested anymore. The other 50, in fact, the other 80%, 90% these days are when we go, oh, well, we will put this up, but here are the consequences. They go, yeah, great, no problem. I'm absolutely happy with that. actually they often want those consequences. They like, you know, that you see, you know, the experienced players have got a sense now for what PD are going to do with this, and they're kind of almost looking for the game that will flow from those consequences. So if we've got a plot and the possible solution is do this and Andy gets punished, you go, yeah, I don't want to do that. I want to do this so Steve gets punished. We're like, yeah, we'll put that up as a solution. You know, character Greg, whatever the character says, can we do this instead so Steve gets punished instead of Andy? We're definitely happy to peg that suggestion to your character.
How much does this aspect of the game design, which I think is good broadly game design, how much does it reflect your view of the real world? in the sense that, like, what you're essentially saying in that, Matt, is you don't believe that there is ever a utopian solution which can make anyone happy and also in love, right? Like,
Wow.
I know that's a serious question. Like, do you think it reflects a kind of your view of how, do you think compromise and not everyone being happy is a natural solution to reality? But I think sometimes you get players who do not believe that to be true about reality, and therefore bring it to LARP, right?
I think a lot of classic role playing and classic fantasy is based on. If you look at the Harry Potter story, let's take the Harry Potter, which is probably the most famous recent stories of whatever. I know hate criminal, so I'm not going there. But the point of that story, which everyone knows, no one at the end, when Voldemort gets defeated, is disappointed. There are, apart from 12 Death Eaters who go off to Azkaban, nobody's sat there going, well, that's not really the outcome I was looking for. I was really, you know, it's an utterly monolithic good versus evil, good triumphs and evil ends and is defeated. And that is a trope that is in every fantasy story, not every, but 70 to 80% of fantasy stories since forever, and is imported into a lot of games, and I find is imported into a lot of real life. I think a lot of real life is informed by our myths that there is good and evil, and it's a conflict between the two, and it's for good to triumph over evil. That's not my worldview. My worldview is that the line between good and evil flows through the heart of every human being, which is a quote by some guy, and I can't remember who, that every person has good and evil inside them, that all of our real world problems that haven't been solved already are complex and nuanced and involve trade-offs and involve horrible, complicated compromises that nobody wants to make. And that's why we haven't just solved the problems already. So yeah, it really does reflect my view of the real world.
My view is less political and has more to do with art, specifically that uniquely,
art can't be political.
Uniquely monolithic and deeply influential piece of art, Neighbours. The gist of which is a character exists in Neighbours only so long as they are having conflict with other people. At the point where their conflict is resolved, they move to Brisbane. And everybody knows that unless they accidentally come back to Ramsay Street at some point in the future, they have had a happy ending. And we don't see that because that happy ending presumably does not contain the endless races around Ramsay Street that their presence in the actual game, if you will, that's being run involves. All for happy endings, but they are boring. By their very nature, they are boring. They're not interesting to watch, and I don't think they're interesting to play through for more than a session or so. So when you have your happy ending, you go to Brisbane, and a new character joins the street, ready to have a fist fight with Charlene over or what have.
Your sound was cutting out a bit there, Andy.
Oh,
I don't know
for goodness sake!
Were you going?
A wonderful Neighbours anecdote, which was much safer than mine.
Yes, I was talking about Neighbours and why I like to think of LARP as a soap opera.
I got bits of it. I mean, I think a soap opera is an amazing model for LARP. It's certainly how I used to run Cambridge University Treasure Trap, which is sort of a 30-person odd, university system. It's been sort of a new system there now, but it's a similar kind of ethos. And I ran that like a soap opera. And like a soap opera, sometimes you have plot elements and they don't work, and so you have to hurriedly shove them down the back of a sofa, and it didn't always all hang together, but it was pretty good. I feel like Empire is like a higher budget than a soap opera, but I always say it's a bit like a, you know, I like the Marvel movies or something, right? Or the Marvel cinematic multimedia universe or whatever it is now, where you've got the ongoing characters and stuff happens to them and whatever, but it's that kind of art, right? It's like but you don't get superheroes who like have happy lives and then they stay that way, right? So inevitably a new writer comes along and goes, actually I want something bad to happen to this character. So it still feels very similar.
I have to disagree. I think Empire is more like Neighbours than it is like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. If you look at soap operas, there's generally a bad guy in any soap opera. They're usually some sort of plutocratic capitalist who runs the hotel, the only business in the street, whatever. And they're always up to no good. But they're usually a fairly... there's only one of them in a cast of sort of 30 or 40, 50, 60 characters. And a lot of the story in Neighbours or any soap is about the interaction of the other people. The stuff the bad person is doing is just one storyline. Whereas if you look at a Marvel Cinematic Universe, you look at Endgame against Thanos, it is all people coming together and uniting against an existential, overwhelming
Okay,
threat.
so I don't mean to say... No, I think you're completely wrong. Actually, Endgame exactly proves my point and proves you're wrong, and this is why. Endgame is not mostly about fighting Thanos. Endgame is mostly about the Avengers kind of going around in various locations, doing some of their best bits again, like meeting up with some people, having relationships with their father, and then at the end they're like, ah yes, the villain.
Yeah,
and then there's a climax. But actually, most of the whole, and the reason I say MCU, not superhero movies in general, is that the MCU has built up this thing around repeating characters who have stories and arcs, and yes, occasionally they punch a mirror version of them themselves in the face about once a movie. But like, in sometimes I think the Marvel villain fights are like the worst part about the Marvel movies, and the things people turn up for are like, oh my goodness, now that Steve's gone, are Sam and Bucky gonna get on? Find out next week on this episode of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where they might also punch someone, but whatever.
I don't want to. I don't want to agree. I don't want to agree with Matt. I don't want to agree with Matt.
Universe than I am.
I don't want to agree with Matt, but I think
yes, it does reflect Matt. What was the question? I'm not even sure what the original question.
I think where you're.
It was how people's different takes on mandates and if we should use conclave declaration instead of a Senate motion. I think we got there.
There's one case we missed out, and this is my favourite case, which is when people write in and say, you've presented a possible solution where thing A happens and it has a bad consequence for person B, but that doesn't go far enough. We'd like to go twice as far and make it twice as bad. Can we have that as an outcome, please? And we're always very happy to support those two. The people who would like it to hurt even more, we like those. Those solutions are great for the game. Really fantastic. Go on. What's the next question?
The next one is from Owen Woodruff. What's the generalized process when it comes to producing the different opportunities events? How do you personally prepare your work for a wins? Now, I'm going to start by saying I look at the list that Andy's written on the plot wiki and choose whichever one I think is most fun for me at the time.
I make a big list on the plot wiki.
You're muted, Andy.
God damn it. A second.
Well, I'm going to take advantage of him being muted. Andy is a brilliant and effective time manager and he's superb.
these are the holes we need to fill. This is the stuff we need to do. And I can create really good, creative, cool stuff out of that. That also I can feel confident is grounded in the world and the themes and the desires of Matt and Andy as kind of ultimate game runners. And if I was writing I'm currently running a game of weird horror, controversial horror game Cult as an RPG. I won't say anything about what's happening in that game for my players, but it's very weird, and the plots and the style of plots I'm running are not the kind of writing I would do for Empire. If I was writing a LARP, I wouldn't write Empire, but I also wouldn't be able to write a fest LARP, if that makes sense. So actually, when I'm writing for Empire, what I like to do is to go, oh, that's cool, and I can pick it up with the kind of stuff that Steve says. And it just feels really good to do that, because actually then you get to realize an idea someone else has had. That's why I like solving maths problems. Like, you're going to go, aha, and that feels really great. I think in script writing, there's this thing called a script doctor, right? Someone who looks at someone else's script they've written and gives it a bit more psh, and like zhuzhes it up. And I love doing that to plots. And I sometimes Matt and Andy will ask me to give my kind of insight onto a Wind of Fortune that they've been rolling around and got stuck with, because sometimes I can provide the sort of psh that they need to like get it over whatever hill that they're on. And they need the bulk of the work to get it finished. So that's what I really, I guess, enjoy doing.
So just to cut in again, I'm going to reread the question just in case people missed that bit. Owen Woodruff asks, what's the generalized process when it comes to producing the different opportunities and events? How do you personally prepare your work for a wins? And I said, I just look at Andy's list and choose whatever I think is funniest for me.
So I make a list. It'll start being made the previous event with the Winds of Fortune we decide we aren't ready for, or the reminders for stuff we need to follow on. It'll also have a list of the things we need to do every event, such as plenipotentiaries or trading opportunities. Then, in the weeks immediately after the event, we'll add more and more stuff to that list, often in the form of quick sentences explaining something we want to look at or something we need to follow on. And then closer to the event, usually around the time downtime is being finalized, we will go through that big list and knock it down to the dozen or so Winds of Fortune we're going to write. And then as we start writing them, we'll find more that we need to do, and we'll end up with 20.
Yeah, so personally, I tend to pick on one I really enjoy the look of, or think that I can do something funny in order to encourage strife and game within a single house or multiple houses or a single nation. And then I'll write what I can in terms of opportunities and weird things that don't come up often. And then I send it off to be looked at.
I think the process for a specific win, certainly for me and Andy, was we usually have a long Discord chat about it. We'll usually kick the issue around back and forth, and talk about it, talk about the people and who they are and what's happening and what might happen and what the consequences. And then as that sort of, we work out what game consequences there might be, how we could mirror or reflect that in the setting. We then offer those, we work out what the options might be. And once we've got the rough shape of it, then one of us will go around, usually Andy, but sometimes me, will go away, write it up. And then once that draft is done, we then start to go through it together with a fine-tooth comb and beat it in, and edit it until we're happy.
I would say that Fortune is mostly only getting good on like the 5th editing pass, right?
Yeah.
And like that's not a bad thing about any of the fourth of the passes. It's just they are actually really quite complicated pieces of writing that you have to produce 20 of an event on a fairly tight schedule, especially mid-year. Like we're talking about what we'd be doing for this event, that isn't happening. Well, as it's the first event, we've had loads of time to write the Winds of Fortune. Obviously, that doesn't mean we've done it, but I certainly think that the E1 one feels slightly less tight than what's the worst gap? Maybe
E2
between
6 week gap
between 3 and 4.
E2 and E3. No,
E3
E3 E4 is 10.
Yeah. And that can be a bit.
I always felt guilty about the fact that we're never very we have all winter to prepare the Winds of Fortune for E1, and then we always leave it to the last minute anyway. And I felt really guilty about that. So I talked to Ian Andrews, who is a superb organizer, at least from my visual perspective, and he ran 2 Odysseys a year. And when I said, well, you must have had all winter to prepare for the first Odyssey, and he was like, yeah, but we left it all to the 6-7 week gap before the event, the same as we did for the second one. And I was like, that made me feel I can't remember quite how he phrased it, but it made me feel much better about my own incompetence.
I think the other thing too, if you plan too much too far in advance, like, it won't be quite as good. There's something about the rush of a I mean, that's maybe my personal thing. There's something about the rush of a deadline and everything feeling current and people be getting excited about the game and everything that, like, for me, helps the process.
I will say...
Go on, Steve.
Sorry, yeah. I have had 3 different anxiety dreams about it being the first event back. And we get there and it's a Thursday and I'm sat down with like people, and then all of a sudden I have this exact realization: we didn't put any Winds of Fortune out. Oh no. Do we have time to write them up and hand them out in little slips of paper?
Yeah, I've had some unpleasant anxiety dreams. Yeah, it would be nice. We have improved. If you think about the early years of Winds of Fortune, we were often still releasing them on the Wednesday and the Thursday of the event. We would be editing them and still getting them up on the wiki 24, 36 hours before the event started. And we've managed to push that to sort of 72 hours before the event starts, which is a definite improvement. If I'd love to get it to 96 hours before the event starts. I would love us to be knocking out the Winds of Fortune 1 a week at the moment, but yeah, lots. I'd also like an end to world famine, and that's not going to happen either. So, got to be realistic. What's the next question?
So Nico the Battle Butler from Twitch asks, how do you work out the spread of Winds of Fortune between nations and houses of power, so the Synod and Conclave, etc.? So I know
what we do. We have a special matrix that we keep on the wall, and that plots every single Wind of Fortune. No, we don't. We really don't. What we do is we write
throw
anything
a lot of
cool.
shit at the wall and hope some of it sticks.
Yeah, we write anything cool we can think about, and then occasionally we go, we haven't done one for X for ages. Think of something cool.
So sometimes Andy will be like, have like a winter mark season or something like that, or a league season or a dawn season, where he basically goes all the plot writers and go like, if you're pitching plots this next event, think about dawn first, because we realise we haven't given them anything for ages, so this and that and that, and we want to make sure we focus. We don't necessarily publicise that's the case. It doesn't always pan out like that, but there's sometimes some directing of creative energies to sort of redress a balance. But would you agree it's more of an art than a science?
No, I think it's a science. We're just not very good at it.
It is in our practice more of an art than science. Yes. In the same way that alchemy is more of an art than the science of chemistry.
There is a thing we do, however, when we've got a Wind of Fortune that has some sort of political implications, we will often take a look at how each of the 5 broad houses of power could interact with that Wind of Fortune. I think that's fair to say. We'll have a Wind of Fortune that is mostly about a diplomatic incident, but it might suggest in our discussion something that Bourse members or Conclave could do that interacts with it directly. And we make a bit of effort to do that. We don't force it, but we take a moment to look at how the other houses could be involved in any political activity that's going on, or another nation might be involved.
It's worth saying that what we don't almost always do, you'll notice in this discussion, we don't write Winds of Fortune for a group. You know, there's no sense, I think, I certainly never would go, oh, that group hasn't got much plot in a while, we should write stuff. But the nation, for when you're talking about Winds of Fortune, like, nations or houses of power are kind of the lowest level on which you can and probably should think. You can have an eye and have a thought that you think that group of players will probably get involved with this plot, but I try not to write plot for a group, if you see what I mean. In that,
Yeah,
certainly,
totally.
certainly for Wind of Fortune level stuff, you do get more individualized stuff in terms of.
I think if a writer pitched me a Wind of Fortune and I looked at it and said, "This seems really aimed at X group," I think the next thing out of my mouth would be, "You should probably be doing this with an NPC in a field." Yeah, nation is the lowest. Nation or House of Power is the lowest level we go to generally. I think of, and we're just not very organised. It is. We go where the cool is. We go where the interesting stories are. We try and spread it around, but we're not disciplined or organised about that.
It's also worth saying that, like, we don't often know what's going on in the field. I mean, like, we have some ways of knowing, but like, actually, we don't necessarily know all the groups that exist because we don't necessarily have a completely up to date central record of that. But also, sometimes a thing that does happen occasionally is that the people on the field have. There might be some point of synod of religious belief that feels fairly settled as a position in the synod, but is in some ways quite controversial to a group of NPCs or many NPCs. And we won't know that position is a settled synod position unless they have told NPCs about it, which is the same as telling us about it, which is to say, pass a statement of principle.
Yeah.
In which case there might be then some reaction to that. Well, there might not, but that's the kind of thing it does. So it's worth like we are trying to represent the world as we understand it to exist through the ways that the elites of the empire, e.g. the people who go to Anvil, have interacted with the rest of the world, which is via Anvil and sorry, I'm kind of saying it wrong, but like we can only base on like what we know about, and ideally it should be stuff we should know because it's kind of IC reflected. Sometimes I might write a plot because I think it might be thematically interesting, but I wouldn't try and do any more than that.
So there is actually a process, and Andy touched on it. We go through every ongoing plot line that's been in Winds of Fortune, or even every ongoing plot line that should have a Winds of Fortune, and we look at those and whether they need one. And then we also go through every General Assembly Greater Majority, I think it is. So we look at all of those and whether those are going to create a Wind of Fortune. And then at the end of that process, that's when we just kind of look around and think, oh, what's not been covered? What should we, we look at the war zones and the military campaigns and we see if that should create Winds of Fortune. And then we just look for cool stuff to put in.
Like a lot of it was the Empire being pushed out of Sermasuak was part of the reason why we did the raid, which was fun, it was easy, like it was aimed very much at a nation, but was the kind of thing that was like, okay, cool, this is reactive of the Wind of War, and this is why we're doing it.
Yeah. Cool. What's our next question? Yeah.
Nose Render asks, appraisals. Is the mechanism working as intended? What was the intent? General fishing for opinions question.
I love appraisals. I love them so much. They are best idea ever. But maybe what I think the intent is perhaps not what the players do. But there's an interesting implication of that perhaps Nose Render doesn't think they're working as intended. I don't know whether that's true or not. If Nose Render's on the channel, I think appraisal was one of the things that the mandates do is they give players, and we deliberately created a mechanism that gives players a way to say, I want to do something different here. And what we discovered was and that's really useful. We talked earlier about why that's valuable. One of the things we discovered in Empire is that periodically I get emails saying, I'd like to do this thing that is not doable via any of the current mechanisms in the game. And the problem was that if you can make that option appear by emailing PD, then you are incentivized to email PD with the options that you would like to appear in the game. So we were in a difficult situation of saying, well, unfortunately, the only thing you've got is the access to the levers that exist. And so what appraisal did was give me an opportunity to say to every single person who says, I don't want to build a fortification, I want to build a giant tower with a sky laser at the top, is to say to that person, you need an appraisal. Because effectively, it's a tool for the players to say, we know there will still be costs, but we want some radical, new, out-of-the-box solution to our problem here.
Again, it's a signaling mechanism. I mean, not to make it sound like as dry as that, but like that historical research has a very sort of similar thing, right? Because if you ask for historical research, that tells you as a plot writer that it is worth writing or expanding on some plot about that thing, because there are some players who are demonstratively interested in it. So in an ideal world, and it's something I think we've, as you sort of said, there's now a process we've reached more and more. And appraisals are, in my view, almost a pinnacle of this kind of ethos. Winds of Fortune are written by the players in that all the seeds, or as many seeds as possible, come from player action or are the consequences of profound decisions that players have taken, and then the world is then reacting to those things. Some stuff happens because stuff just happens and you can't predict it, and that's fine. That's fine too. And I think there will always be a place for that stuff. But I really like Winds of Fortune that feel like they are the equal and opposite reaction to the action of the players.
Go
on, Andy.
If I had 3 pieces of advice from my own personal point of view around appraisals, they would be: keep them general rather than specific. Look at a larger scale problem rather than a specific problem, maybe. Because the more specific the problem is, the more you are tying our hands in terms of what we can do with it. So I like more things like, what can we do about tariffs, or how can we improve our relations with somebody, rather than what will happen if we send a giant diamond to Jarm. Secondly, don't go into them with an expectation of what the outcome is going to be, because you are likely to be disappointed. And don't try and use them to reverse consequences or prices that you have paid because of decisions you have already made. And finally, expect them to generate a wind of fortune, which means that the outcome is likely to come with costs, consequences, and conflicts.
One caveat I would say, I mean, I love appraisals. I'm not a lover of historical research. If I could have 3 appraisals as an event and 1 historical researching event, I'd be a very happy man, and I think Empire would be a better game. I think appraisal is fundamentally request Wind of Fortune on this subject. It is a giant lever saying we want plot here, right here, about this thing here. As Andy says, it will come with consequences, but it inherently has opportunities simply because it is a piece of plot. So yeah, I think it's working as intended. I wish there were more of them.
What's the barrier to there being more of them? How much time you can commit?
Time, yeah. Historical research takes more time than any other piece of plot, in my opinion. And there's just a limited amount of time. So we can't offer more levers to create plot until we're able to manage the plot we're creating better. You know, it's yeah.
And Aura Pup says that they thought it was how much will X action cost rather than civil servants can we explore the depths of the ocean of a Mero army. And I think because the wiki says it has to be about a known problem or current situation, so I'm not quite sure you could use an appraisal for something quite as ambitious as that. But I suppose an appraisal to like, are there more ways we could explore the oceans? Are not like it's not outside the realms of Andy's nodding. Possibly he likes fish people.
No, my point is, if somebody were to submit, can we explore the depths of the ocean with a Mero army? Our outcome would depend slightly on who they picked, but I suspect the outcome would be no. But here are 3 ways you could explore the ocean, and 1 way you could raise a Mero army.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't discard it unless we were in a really bad mood?
We wouldn't discard it. We talk endlessly about how there's a kind of Mornington Crescent approach to plot writing. You know, we don't. The response can't be no, that doesn't work. Goodbye, thank you, thanks for playing. The response has always got to be well, no, But here's something you could do, or something you could have, or some. There's got to be a. Otherwise, there's no wind of fortune. There's no wind of fortune that says the player Senate requested X, but it wasn't possible and nothing happened. And that's just not a wind of fortune. So yeah, totally.
This is also one of the things that would have been picked up during your scrutiny discussions with John and Amy, because if it's a thing of saying we want to go to the moon, no, why? That's not gonna make fun.
Well, yeah, there's stuff about what the themes of the game are. So you will never be able to create gunpowder with an appraisal, if you see what I mean. To pick an example of things that would obviously make the game like Maelstrom, there are things which are discovery of new technology, and indeed discovery in that kind of sense, or more in general, is not a theme of Empire. It doesn't mean that it has never happened in the Empire world. It's just that in the particular slice of history that we are looking at when we run this game called Empire, like, there is not going to be an industrial revolution. So there are clearly limits in that sense.
Thinking about scrutiny as it applies to appraisals, I don't think, as long as the request was an in-character request, and there's no, you can't phrase, we want to discover gunpowder, civil service. It's really hard to phrase that in character.
Right, indeed.
But as long as it is an in-character question, even something as off the wall as how can we invade the moon, I don't think we would say you cannot ask the civil service to appraise that. We might say you're going to need to manage their expectations that this is like that the most efficient civil servant is probably not the best person to ask about.
I mean, to be clear, I want someone to ask the appraisals person who's like big wild projects. How do we invade the moon?
Exactly.
Because I will Bagsy writing that Wind of Fortune, whatever it is, whatever it is that Matt lets me do.
And I have
There's
no
two
idea.
points here that I think are interesting. One is that actually, in practice in the field, the fact that appraisals are a really limited resource means that the crazy ideas don't usually get through. The stuff that gets through is the stuff other players think, oh yeah, that could be valuable. Yeah, I'll support that. And that's that's a positive. But we do sometimes in plot get into situations where we're like, what are we going to do with this? The players have sent this plenipotentiary to Siaka, and Siaka has no interest in talking to the players. What are we going to do? And sometimes we will bang our heads against that for days and days until we work out how to reframe the problem into something will happen that will be interesting in play. You won't always get the solution you want, but something will happen.
I will say, should we flag how we talked a lot about appraisals? They're a newer element of the game in some sense. How in the game, if you're watching this and going, people are doing really boring stuff for appraisals, I want to invade the moon and also Jupiter or the stars with my Mero army of tanks. This won't happen. You want to win the political game and get that forward. So how do they make it happen in the game?
It's a Senate motion. It's a Senate motion that the Senate passes. That's it.
So in theory, you could have someone they could delegate the power to a title. I have no comment on whether or not that would be a good idea for the Senate, but it is a power that they possess. At present, it costs a use of a Senate motion, of which senators only get one per session. And if you know any senators in game, you'll know how precious those are. And then the Senate has to pass it. It doesn't need any sort of supermajority. It just needs a majority of senators. That is the only way in the game that you get appraisals. Yep. So now you know, and now you have a thing to come on and fight for in the political game, right? Because sometimes people, it can be like, I think it's good. I have ideas. If I was playing a character, what I would like to do and pursue if I was interested in interacting a lot of those. And personally, if I was playing, I'd be like, I want to be a senator who is like this, who basically makes themselves the sort of blue sky thinking, like, what politician who just comes up with who just corners the market on getting good appraisals through that have impact every time. That sounds really fun to me.
Go on, what were you going to say about plenipotentiaries, Andy?
But I was going to say that appraisal is like a plenipotentiary in a way. We wouldn't want to have a result in which nothing happens if we can possibly avoid it, but sometimes the thing that happens is weird. So, for example, we had a plenipotentiary who wanted to talk to a specific character, and instead of getting that specific character, they got a completely different character, wearing that character as a hat, basically, who engaged in ridiculous shenanigans while something else was going on with a different piece of plot, which meant that we'd never have to deal with that character ever again. And it was definitely a thing that happened. Likewise, when the players recently used Plenipotentiary to want to talk to Yorna Graf for like the third time, we had basically Ossegran. We pulled Ossegran out of our backsides instead. And the same thing will happen with an appraisal. That moon appraisal, I really want somebody to ask it now. I've got loads of ideas about how we can make the moon exciting in the game. But what I was actually saying when we were talking about scrutiny is, we might in theory say, you can already do this, that information already exists, or this is a better tool to get the outcome that you clearly want.
Yeah. But what we wouldn't do, but the scrutiny process is very much focused on the legal process and on the practical processes. And the practical processes of a appraisal is players ask a question. They can ask anything they want. So we don't scrutinise the question. Cool. I hope that's answered Nose Render's question.
I don't know if we wanted to talk a bit more about how to write a good plenipotentiary. I don't think we want to criticise anyone.
I don't think we do.
No? Okay. Fine.
We've given some guidance on plenipotentiary before.
Okay, cool.
Instead, we're going to answer Tim Baker's question, which he refers to as a controversial one. To what extent do you use the requirements for Winds of Fortune as a resource sink or game balancing mechanism? On the basis that you want decisions to be meaningful, does that mean you need to increase costs as player numbers grow?
I think, well, I'm going to pick this up first of all, just because I'm probably the most, certainly more economically focused than Andy is on the plot writing front. And the answer is, honestly, we don't give it a lot of thought. We don't look at the player numbers and think, oh, they've increased 7% since last year, so we should increase the costs of things by 7%. That just doesn't, we don't micromanage to that degree. We just, as Andy said, most of our process is throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. And the critical, I think there's a flaw in the thinking there. If we've had 10%, that the principle of economics in LARP is that things will cost. It doesn't matter if the costs have changed over time because the amount of wealth in the system has changed over time. Providing things have a cost, then those costs are still meaningful and you're still making economic choices and economic decisions. We do need to keep our eye on it. We absolutely do need to be aware of what a wain of white granite is worth or what a wain of mithril is worth, because we need to ensure that the costs we're putting remain meaningful. But actually, what's happening in the field is desperately more important than our spreadsheets. So I'll give you an example of that. If I run a piece of plot about white granite and say, oh, you could do this if you'll just take 20 wains of white granite to build this jewellery shop. At the same time that the Imperatrix has announced a complete moratorium on any white granite because it all got to be diverted to fortifying the southern coast of the Empire, all my spreadsheets about how much white granite there is in the Empire aren't worth a shite. The reality is that white granite will be in desperately short supply in the Empire because of the Imperatrix, and none of my numbers will mean jack shit. So we don't spend hours and hours and hours tracking things on spreadsheets to try and get a sense of what things are worth, because the actions of players will have more effect on that than the numbers of players.
Am I right in saying that you do sometimes make adjustments to various things based on plot, in the sense that, I know we've done plot before where if it would be reasonable for a plot to have caused there to be a Liao shortage, then other completely unrelated plots, or like the Bourse public auction and things like that, will have less resource in. So that, which is not the question I think that Tim is asking, but it can sometimes feel like plots and the supply of things are responding, but I think it's actually almost the other way around.
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
if the Empire like embargoed one of their main ways of getting mana crystals in, then I think yes, there would be a reduction in mana crystals available on the public auction. Or other ways of getting it.
And if I was writing a plot with some NPCs who were trying to do a ritual for something or other, and they needed some mana crystals, I might use the fact that I think that generically for people in the Empire right now, mana crystals are short. To sort of that would possibly then drive the NPCs' motivations, and actually might be that we send them in willing to pay a bit more for mana crystals than what we might otherwise guess. Say.
Yeah, we try to keep things consistent, and if we're running a piece of plot about there being a Liao shortage in the Empire, it makes sense for that to be reflected in other things. But it's not because we're trying to achieve some great rebalancing. We might occasionally go, oh man, there's loads of iridescent gloaming in the game because players aren't really using it for X. Let's run a plot where they can build a giant iridescent gloaming mountain. But it's more a consequence of let's give them a way to respond to that glut than it is an attempt. Because the thing is, you can't rebalance the game with a Wind of Fortune, right? And this goes actually really to the heart. You can't rebalance a game with the Wind of Fortune. The reason you can't rebalance the game with the Wind of Fortune is because Winds of Fortune have choices in them. That's baked into them. So players could just decide not to do that thing. If I think I'm going to run a Wind of Fortune to get rid of 5,000 iridescent gloaming out of the Empire's player base, and the players go, well, yeah, we choose not to take that solution, they haven't achieved anything. If I need to rebalance the game, we'll just rebalance it. We'll just go, we've got something wrong, we need to fix that.
It's worth saying that the introduction of mandates presumably changed the Liao market. But as far as I'm aware, although I think a happy thing with that is that it made Liao sort of a more salient resource. It's not the reason you introduced mandates in the first place. And that I mention that because that's not an individual Wind of Fortune, right? That was a change to the game which did have an economic impact.
But we'll often bring new ways in for the players to use a phrase that we've used in other games, flush stuff down the toilet. There's an odd principle in a game, which is you only actually need one sink. You can have as many sources as you like, but you only need one sink. But if you've got a sink for resources to leave the system and you've only one sink, then ultimately all the resources will be flushed down that one toilet because there's nowhere else for them to go. And that's intrinsically less interesting than an environment in which you can flush resources down different toilets, where you can basically sink them out of the game through many, many different routes. So Liao was going into the game and it could only really be got rid of in one way, using it on Liao ceremonies. So the game intrinsically becomes more interesting the moment there are other ways to use Liao.
Is that true of money? I guess because you've got people can overcharge their personal resources and things. So that's as well as the Senate.
And ministries.
And ministries, of course, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Senate is the big sink. That is a big sink of money out of the game because they build stuff and that requires money. And so what happens is people, I'm not going to go into it of how they sink, but the Senate.
There's a good podcast on it here.
There is, yeah. The Senate sinks resources. But what we did was we give the Synod the ability to sink Liao out of the system by giving them a tool they could use at a cost. I would have more sinks for Liao, but not because I'm trying to rebalance something, just because I think the game is more interesting. It's downloadable content. The game's more interesting with new options to play.
I think there is one, isn't there? Isn't there like a ministry that the Loyalty Assembly have where they can trade Liao for white granite?
Liao to the Axos.
Yeah, that's not a sink. And the reason it's not a sink is because the amount that you can flush down that toilet is restricted. So it's not. It is sinking because it is sinking those resources out of the system. They are coming out of the system. But the players can't go, right, we put 2,000 Liao in and get 100 white granite. They don't have that option.
Could we move on to the next question before I have a nosebleed?
Please. So let's do Thomas Garish. The selling of Feroz to the Grendel was mentioned in the Winds of War for Segura. Is there a particular reason why Spiral wasn't mentioned in the one for Zenith?
Consistency is boring.
I have no idea
I mean,
what the answer to this is.
I think it's because it was more of a... So the Empire had more recently lost Feroz. And it felt like... And it hadn't been lost previously. So Spiral being given to the Grendel felt like less of a monumental impact than Feroz did, to me at least.
It's interesting. I think there's an artistic element, I'm afraid. So the Grendel have a better relationship with the Brascos. They're more likely to raise the Feroz. Feroz was more of a hot button issue. The Empire wasn't technically giving Spiral to the Grendel either, because they didn't control it at the time. They were giving up some regions of it in a territory that's also partially controlled by the Druge. There's nothing sinister going on here. It just didn't make it into a Wind of Fortune. That happens all the time with diplomatic and political stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the level of difference. I think Andy's hit on it there. With Spiral, the Empire controlled 1 or 2 regions, and the Grendel controlled 2 or 3 regions, and I think had the balance of control in the territory. So what they were really saying is, well, as part of this peace treaty, you've got to give up those 2 regions and formalise our control. Whereas with Feroz, it seemed to be more the other way, that basically the Grendel was saying, we demand that control of this flips to us. It was a bigger deal. But yeah, there's not some... We don't keep a meticulous track of every Wind of Fortune and check we've done it all the same way every time. We just go mad.
Go.
I mean, we're going mad anyway, but it would be worse. It would be worse.
We'd lose track of everything, and then everything would go wrong. It'd be fine. So on a related question from Marcus, can I have my ball open parentheses Feroz, close parentheses for back? They want Feroz back.
Sure.
Yeah. Just declare war.
Yeah, well, you don't even need to declare war because a general can always issue orders to the army. Well, I mean, a session of consequences will then ensue, but all you need to do is to become a general, and then give an order in downtime for your army to invade Feroz. And that has every potential, theoretically, to bring Feroz back under Imperial control. You should expect some consequences to result from that action.
Basically, there's like, I think, in 7 or 8 years, I can bring to mind 1, 2 red lines in the entire campaign where I at least have put my foot down and said, this can't happen, or this isn't going to be something that is possible. And none of them are about who controls a territory.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So I mean, it's a silly answer, but I think the important thing is, like, you don't need to tell the Grendel beforehand, or you could believe that it's really honorable. So the question for me is not, can you get Feroz back? It's because if I was playing a Basque right now, I'd probably play on the balance of wanting to get Feroz back. So I'd think about how I could achieve that, and then it's not necessarily even via war. It's a brass coast, right? I mean, like, can you just what is the price of some prime real estate in nowadays? Probably more expensive than you can afford, probably. But you never know. Those Grendel, they're always good for a bit of wheel diggering, right? Maybe. Probably
the big point here is we don't run this stuff for the good of our health. The only reason that Feroz is in the hands of the Grendel now is so that a whole load of players can have fun getting it back again.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing set in stone about any of this. Whether they'll ever get it back is a different question. But can you get it back? Gosh, yes.
What we got next?
So there is one from a name that I'm not even going to try and pronounce, but it is from Twitch. Has there ever been a Wind of Fortune you regret publishing, whether it's because it's clear isn't clear enough to the players or contradicts some existing lore?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Next question.
Yeah, loads. I mean, to be honest, that's like saying, have you ever run a plot that you've, in hindsight, regretted running? It's like, oh
Yeah.
God, yes. Yeah. And for all of those reasons, we've run them where it wasn't sufficiently clear, where they've created precedents. We were like, oh no, that was a mistake. And I think sometimes we even just owned it and gone, yeah, we did this, but we shouldn't have done. We're very sorry. We'll accept the consequences this time, but this is not happening again. Just to be clear. We're not perfect. Gosh, we make mistakes. Only 70% of the time, if we're lucky.
But we're not going into any more detail than that, needless to say.
No.
Oh yeah, gosh.
Yeah. If you thought there was a humorous anecdote about that, no. There's a magic curtain. The game is less fun if we put all our mistakes on the table and go, yeah, this thing you've really enjoyed, that was a tragic mistake.
Yeah, I sometimes might discuss that with friends, but even then, I wouldn't. I think it's good to there's a propriety thing, because once you've seen how the sausage is made, it's very hard to enjoy the sausage in the same way.
Yeah,
and I mean, obviously, here we are sort of displaying elements of the.
We're showing you around a beautiful sausage factory, but the machines are not on.
Yeah, exactly. You're not. You are not. Andy is not currently topless and sort of weep, crying, laughing while dressed as Sadogura and trying to work hard.
You were going in a very different direction than I expected you to. I was expecting to have a meat cleaver in either hand and be covered in offal in this vision.
Oh well, that happens too, right? But the point is that there is. Yeah.
Although I was feeling smug about vegetarian sausages, which are made out of hope and love, I understand. Should we have our next question?
Yeah.
I actually can't see any other questions.
I think we're done. We've been at this for some time. Good.
Yeah.
That was good.
Right.
Thank you, everyone, for your excellent questions. We hope we've answered everything.
Super.
That we refused to do so.
Thank you guys for having me on. And I'm looking forward to writing some Winds of Fortune, which will come out at some point, hopefully.
Yes.
We actually have half a Wind of Fortune written. We just binned it off completely about a month ago, I think.
Sounds very productive.
I've had a conversation with you about Wind of Fortune that I may even write at some point.
Right. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for hosting, Steve.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
It is possible that the civil service are either just starting or have been going for 3/4 of an hour. I can't remember what time it was. You can find the link to their Zoom on our Facebook group if you want to pop in with them and ask them questions about appraisal. But until then, we should wait. Bye-bye.
Everyone.
So I know where to cut it when I put it on the YouTube. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.